While most privately owned railway companies, besides Locking Railways and Tramways, were dissolved into the Victorian Railways in the early 1800s, there were a couple of exceptions, which survived into the 1950s. This was the Koontruk Tramway, and in today's video, we'll be covering the Koontruk line's history, closure, geography and infrastructure, rolling stock, some stations along the line, where it is today, and will services be resumed. History/closure. The Koontruk line was built and operated not by the Victorian Railways, but by the Shire of Swan Hill. It was the first line to be opened under the Tramway in Country District Act in 1886, which enabled local councils and governments to construct tramways with financial assistance from the state government, with a max of £2,000 per mile. The cost of building the line was to be paid back by the councils with interest, and the time frame they had to pay back their debts was a max of 30 years. Another line to be built as part of this scheme was the Kadamatite Tramway, which ran from Dookie to Kadamatite. The Koontruk line was contracted to be constructed by Messrs. Dean Munro and Co., whose name you'll see pop up everywhere in the railway construction scene in the late 1800s. Construction started on the line from Kerang to Koontruk in 1887. After 2 years of construction, the line was opened by the Minister for Public Works on the 20th of July 1889. Between 1885 and 1893, the large Shire of Swan Hill once spanned from the South Australian border to Kahuna. It was subdivided into 3 more shires, these being the Shire of Gordon, the Shire of Mildura, and the Shire of Castle Donington, with the Shire of Swan Hill still operating and owning the tramway. However, the town of Swan Hill didn't actually fall under their boundaries anymore. This confusion lasted until 1898, when the Shire of Swan Hill was renamed to the Shire of Kerang, and the Shire of Castle Donington was renamed to the Shire of Swan Hill. By 1920, the tramway's debts had been paid off, coming to a total of £39,229. That's around $3 million. Since all railway companies needed an office, the tramway's main office was the Koontruk Goods Shed, built in 1890. At the same time, it was also being used to store goods. The primary traffic on the line was river red gum timber and farming produce, although general goods and farming supplies would also be delivered along the line. Paddle steamers from all along the Murray River would also deliver wool, wheat and other items to and from Koontruk. These goods would be stored at the Koontruk Goods Shed until it was to be transported elsewhere via rail. On the 1st of February 1952, the tramway was officially handed over to the Victorian Railways, but it had been on the Victorian Railways maps since 1895, which is the earliest map I can find. My guess is that it was put on these maps as the line was still broad gauge, as well as the line was built with assistance from the government. In its remaining years under the Victorian Railways, the line was served by 102 horsepower rail motors. I don't think there actually would have been a passenger service if the last remaining years weren't funded by the Education Department to transport school children, which I'm using one of their computers to type up the script. The line survived for 24 more years under the Victorian Railways before passenger services were withdrawn in December 1976, a farewell tour ran on the 20th of November 1979, and the line closed to all traffic on the 3rd of March 1981, partly due to poor sleeper condition. Geography and infrastructure. The Koontruk line ran 22.43 kilometers from Kerang to the riverside town of Koontruk. There were a total of 5 stations and 6 rail motor stopping places, with most of the stations being extremely lackluster metal sheds on wooden stilts. I think I am right when I say Teal Point was the smallest station on the Victorian Railway network, which wasn't a stopping place, both in terms of platform size and station building. The line also lacked interesting features, although there were a few sizable trestles over the Pyramid Creek number 1 main channel, Bar Creek number 5 main channel, and number 4 main channel, and the remarkably small station buildings are probably also an interesting feature. While I haven't been able to find a line diagram for the line ran mostly on flat terrain until the terminus. Being a tramway, the line actually had no form of signalling. What I meant by that is that the line was entirely controlled using a single staff, with the only signal on the line being a home signal protecting Kerang. This was easily achieved as there's only one passing loop on the line, and no, not a loop siding, like the one at Hinkston's and the Koontruk Cattle Yard. They were only ever used for shunting and are not the same as passing loops. The only passing loop was at Koontruk. This also meant that the shunting practices for Koontruk were interesting to say the least, as you would see locomotives sandwiched between wagons at Koontruk very often. Being a tramway, the line was also not fenced or protected in any way. This meant in areas where the train traversed in built-up areas, the line was restricted to around 25 km per hour, like leaving Kerang or going down Main Street in Koontruk, which I guess is another interesting feature. although you wouldn't be able to go much faster than 25 km per hour, as the line was built light using 50-pound rails, unlike the normal 60-pound rails for the lightest of the Victorian network. This meant that only K, J, and D3 classes were allowed to travel on it. Just barely though. But they were only allowed to travel on the line at a max of 25 km per hour. However, they would never make a regular appearance on the line until the tramway was handed over to the Victorian Railways. While some lines would connect up with other lines with the New South Wales network at the Murray River, the Cundrook line was one of the few exceptions to this rule, being closer to a Victorian Railways station over the border, which was Wakul on the Balranald line. The closest New South Wales government railway station was Finley, 160 km east. There was another siding called Yaleburn Siding, 3.5 km down from Pyramid Hill Creek. Not entirely sure what the siding served, as there doesn't seem to be anything where it once sat besides this massive yellow lawn. Rolling stock. As the Cundrook line was a privately owned rail line, it needed to purchase its own rolling stock. The first engine acquired to operate the line was a tank engine, number 34, which was sold in 1899 and was built for the Geelong and Melbourne Rail Company, all the way back in 1854, being named Titania, first being a 222 tank engine. It was acquired by the Victorian Railways in September 1860, and in 1872 it was converted to an 060 well tank, and was used as a shunter at Williamstown workshops. In 1899 it was sold off to the tramway for £800. Eventually, it was too frail and was sold off to the Sunshine Harvester Company sometime before 1925. At that point, it was the last surviving steam engine of its kind, and it must have been sold before 1925 as the Historical Society of Victoria asked for it to be preserved on the 12th of September 1925. Although apparently it was still scrapped. However, one of its brass number plates was presented to the ARHS in 1949. The next engine to work the line was K-Class number 144. No, not that K-Class. This K-Class. It worked the line around 1910. There is little known about this engine, just like the next that would work on the line, D122, who worked on the line from 1920 to 1948. There isn't really any other information on it, and this information was also gathered from a Pinterest post, which is obviously always the most reliable source of information. Now for an engine with a lot more history. T267. It was built by the Phoenix Foundry in Ballarat and was put into service on the 11th of December 1874. After reaching 27 years old on the Victorian Railways hauling goods, it was reboiled in 1901. In the late 10s to late 20s, the VR were finally getting rid of their old surplus locos. D267 was not going to last much longer, and it was withdrawn on the 18th of November 1921. Not long after, it was bought by the tramway for £1,750, around $140,000 today. Soon after, it arrived on the Cundrook tramway to start its new life. Another T-Class was also sold, however that one was sold for use to construct rail lines in South Australia. During its stay on the tramway, T267 was given the nickname Bucking Kate. In 1929, a small little four-wheel vertical boiler engine was ordered and imported from England. It was constructed in the Sentinel Carriage Works in Shrewsbury. If you know your English railways, you would realise that this engine bears a striking resemblance to the London and North Eastern Railway Y1 and Y3 Sentinel shunters. I think someone did a little plagiarism. The Sentinel was ordered to work the line, but also shunt at the Murray River Wharf. The shunter was withdrawn in 1941. My guess is that it was relatively weak and it couldn't handle the long distance as well. It was stored until 1952, when it was scrapped once the government takeover occurred. T267 was also unfortunately scrapped not long after the takeover, as the Victorian Railways found no use for it. It was the second oldest operating locomotive in Victoria when withdrawn, despite it last being used in 1950. It was sold at auction for £255, around $12,000 today, and broken up into scrap not long after. I don't know if there were ever efforts to preserve it. There was also this AEC truck rail motor Beetle thing. Anyways, this Frankenstein was assembled in 1943 out of a Ford V8 truck and a passenger carriage, which was actually made from the first carriage used on the tramway all the way back in 1889. The carriage was built by Duncan and Fraser in 1885 and was first used in South Australia. Eventually, it was purchased by the Shire of Swan Hill, and it ran all the way until 1942. Eventually, it was getting too old, so it was refurbished and converted into a rail motor, which is where the back axle comes from. It carried mostly school children for the years it was in service, and was replaced by diesel-hauled trains or 102 horsepower rail motors in 1958. Now, locomotives aren't the only thing that the tramway owned. They also had to buy their own rolling stock, one of which was 324ZL, which to my knowledge was the only brake van used on the line. There's probably more engines which worked the line, and certainly more rolling stock. However, that was everything I could find and was documented online, on the engines at least. Victorian Railways rolling stock. Once the Victorian Railways took over the tramway, all the ancient steam locomotives which were running on the line at the time were very quickly withdrawn, and all were unfortunately cut up. The rail motor was used until 1958, however that too was eventually replaced by 102 horsepower rail motors, K, J, Y, and D3 class steam locomotives, which were the only steam engines light enough to travel on the line, barring E-class tank engines, as the Victorian Railways could definitely ship one over that distance. And Y-classes were actually never seen working the tramway. After the abolition of steam, T-classes handled all the work until the line's closure. I'm not aware of any Y-class diesels that ran on the line. Some stations along the line. All the intermediate stations on the Kundruk line have a very boring history. They were owned, they were opened, ownership was transferred, and they were closed. The only interesting one was Yaleburn, which was closed when the ownership was transferred, and on the same day a new station was opened further down the line, closer to Pyramid Creek, which was called Pyramid Creek. So let's do Kundruk. Kundruk Railway Station was opened on the 19th of July 1889. It was a very interesting station, but not for its building, for its layout and location. The rail line into Kundruk was located smack bang in the middle of Main Street, which is where the station was, but you'll see the entire yard was also offset, with the goods shed being here, which meant the rail line had to cross Main Street several times, so if shunting movements were to take place, then road traffic would have to wait. Kundruk also featured a 50-foot turntable, which was necessary for rail motors and a few steam locomotives. Kundruk also featured a small single-road engine shed. I'm pretty sure this is just a place to house the engines, and not actually where they were maintained. That would have most likely been done at Kerrang, although I haven't been able to find any information on that. To the north of the yard limits was the Arbuthnot sawmill/timber siding, which extended the line about 300 meters to serve the, well, Arbuthnot sawmill. The sawmill exported moderate amounts of river red gum. Some went out via rail, and some went out via the river. Miraculously, the sawmill survives today, and still ships out small quantities of timber. Speaking of sidings, a few kilometers away from the station was this platform, which I believe was the Kundruk cattle siding. It basically did as the name said, a platform to load livestock. It was most likely built as leading a herd of cows down Main Street to get to Kundruk wasn't exactly the greatest spectacle. By the 1960s, the turntable was out of service, which led to the demise of steam on the line. By 1978, the staff and ticket wasn't to be regularly used on the Kundruk line. Instead, the guard would handle all safe working from then on. The only exceptions are when trains needed to cross each other, which they couldn't anyways, except at Hickson. The station and passenger services ceased on the 1st of March 1983, with the line closing shortly behind on the 3rd. Where is it today? Today, there are many traces of the rail line left. Out of the 6 stations which were on the line, an impressive 4 still exist: Teal Point, Kingston's, Ganawara, and Kundruk. Out of those 4, all still have their original station buildings and platforms. My guess to the reason why the intermediate stations were removed is because they were right next to the road and take up minimal space. There isn't any remnant track for most of the line's length. Only a few pieces regressed into Main Street in Kundruk, and some track leading out of Kerrang. Kundruk Station minus the turntable, engine shed, and other goods shed still survives in its entirety. The entire station building is beautifully preserved, and we can't talk about Kundruk Station without talking about the items of rolling stock preserved out front, which was mostly all used on the tramway. We have 224ZL, it was the brake van used on the Kundruk line. QR288, an open bogie wooden body goods wagon. Z315, a sheep van, and this Sentinel locomotive. Wait, but the Sentinel locomotive was cut up in 1952, so what is it? Well, this was actually a replica engine built in 1984. There are several differences with the replica and the actual engine. The replica's edges are more rounded, it has different wheels, it's hollow, and the running board does not extend outwards as much. I'm not sure if it was ever converted from anything, presumably not. There is a proposed rail trail from Kerrang to Kundruk, and the Ganawara Shire Council has received $500,000 from Regional Development Victoria in 2022 to support the planning process, which is quite a bit. As of today, no work on the trail has begun, and no, I would not recommend biking on the alignment currently. Even if it's mostly intact, you never know what creepy crawlies could be hiding underneath, as well as all the trestles are now destroyed. The last thing I'm going to mention was the rail motor. Now, I purposely left out what happened as vague as I could. After 1958, it wasn't actually scrapped. The entire thing was sold to a buyer in Runnymede, just outside of Elmore. It sat on a Runnymede property for over 45 years. There was an attempt to purchase it in the 1990s, however those weren't successful. In early 2023, arrangements were made and the rail motor was purchased by the Kerrang Museum. On the 21st of October, the front portion left Runnymede and the carriage portion was picked up on the 4th of November 2 weeks later. RM45, the rail motor, currently sits at the Kerrang Museum, restored by volunteers. Will services resume? Nope. For the price of 22 kilometers of new track, I can think of about 50 other better things the government could be spending that money on. The cost of constructing the line was around £39,229, which, as I said all the way back at the start of the video, is around $3 million today. Let's say around $10 million today, as it would obviously go over budget, and you aren't getting a rail line built for $3 million today. The towns along the alignment are too small to even exist, so the only station will be Kundruk. So Kundruk and Barham, with a combined population of 2,670, has a comparable population to somewhere like Rochester, 2,802. In 2018, a little outdated but whatever, Rochester had around 3,836 boardings. So you would expect Kundruk to have around 10.5 boardings every day. Even a brick could figure out that for $10 million, only have 10 people use your service isn't ideal, and they would still have to change trains for the twice daily Swan Hill service at Kerrang, so nobody would really even benefit. Thanks for watching everyone, I hope you liked this video on the Kundruk tramway. Yes, I know many of you have been asking for Kudgewa, and I've been looking forward to making a video on Kudgewa for a while. However, before I get started on that video, I do want to acquire a copy of A Railway to Kudgewa by Nick Archin. So that's taking a little longer than I hoped. The next video will be a very special video with information not easily accessible online. And while I was procrastinating on making this video, the first set of Melbourne's new Extrapolis 2.0 trains arrived, so here's some photos from that. These trains will be on our rails very soon, and soon all the comm engines will be displaced. If you have any suggestions for other videos, leave them in the comments below. If not, like and subscribe, and I'll see you later.